Since January 2025, we have been receiving an increasing number of inquiries from foreign carriers regarding deposits collected during RMPD inspections. On our website, we explain what an RMPD inspection is, who it applies to, and how it differs from a scent inspection. In this video, however, we focus specifically on penalties imposed for RMPD violations, particularly whether it's possible to avoid penalties for unintentional mistakes. We also highlight how the deposit return process works, how long the proceedings can take, what costs the carrier should expect, and whether full or partial waivers of penalties are possible. When analyzing the inspection reports submitted to us, we find that many cases involve very minor, clearly unintentional issues. These are often small and accidental mistakes in completing the RMPD notification, such as typos or spelling errors. Some mistakes result from changes in the border crossing point made by the driver who fails to inform the dispatcher, which leads to the RMPD notification not being updated accordingly. Another common category includes GPS-related violations, for example, interruptions in data transmission or activating the GPS device only after crossing the border instead of before, as clearly required by the regulations. We have described the most common RMPD violations on our website. The link to that article is available below this video. Even though these cases typically involve minor errors, it's important to understand that penalties can still be imposed, even for seemingly insignificant issues. In the case of foreign carriers, who are the primary subjects of RMPD inspections, a deposit is collected if a violation is found. The deposit amount corresponds to the expected penalty and is a condition for releasing the vehicle. If the deposit is paid in cash, the vehicle is released immediately. However, payment of the deposit does not determine the final outcome of the case. One of the first questions carriers ask after an RMPD inspection is whether the penalty can be reduced or the deposit refunded. The RMPD rules, just like those of scent, impose fixed penalties, meaning each violation has a set amount, such as 10,000 PLN or 12,000 PLN, regardless of whether the mistake was minor or more serious. These penalties are not subject to scaling or adjustment. Even though such penalties may seem disproportionate, they are currently applied in this strict form. So if the law prescribes a penalty of 10,000 PLN for a certain violation, the authority cannot impose a lower amount like 2,000 or 4,000 PLN instead. Unlike RMPD, the scent regulations explicitly allow authorities to waive the penalty entirely. This is important because waiving a penalty is legally different from discontinuing a case. When a case is discontinued, it means the carrier is not liable at all, but when a penalty is waived, the authority acknowledges the violation, recognizes that the carrier is responsible, but still chooses not to impose a fine, for example, because the violation was minor or because a penalty would be disproportionate. However, in the case of RMPD, there is no provision that directly allows for waiving a penalty. This is a fundamental difference between the RMPD and scent frameworks. RMPD rules only allow for the case to be discontinued if the carrier can prove they had no control over the violation. Still, in our view, there may be room to apply general administrative law provisions which require authorities to refrain from imposing penalties if the violation is negligible and the issue has been resolved. Unfortunately, current court rulings are not favorable to carriers on this matter. So, if penalties can't be reduced and waivers are uncertain, does that mean penalties are unavoidable? Not necessarily. There are cases where carriers can successfully defend themselves by pointing to specific circumstances. For example, system outages or GPS signal problems near the border, which may cause brief interruptions in data transmission. It's also worth highlighting technical issues beyond the carrier's control, like signal interference or cases where the GPS outage occurred while the vehicle was stationary. Another defense might apply if the GPS transmission gap lasted less than 1 hour, as the RMPD regulations refer to the scent law, which allows such a margin of error. This, however, does not apply if the GPS tracker was activated after crossing the border instead of before. Nonetheless, even in such cases, it's worth presenting these arguments to the authority for consideration. Sometimes, inspection reports incorrectly state that a violation occurred due to incorrect RMPD notification data, but after further explanation and document submission, it may turn out there was no violation at all. In other cases, legal uncertainties may arise, such as whether a particular journey required RMPD notification at all, or there may be differing interpretations of what the law requires under specific circumstances. It's important to understand that each case is assessed individually. Depending on the facts, different arguments may help or hurt the carrier. Ultimately, it's the authority's responsibility to evaluate the specific situation and decide accordingly. A full review of the circumstances is always necessary. Companies seeking a deposit refund should also be aware that the administrative process can take several months, even up to a year or more, and the outcome is not guaranteed. Carriers cannot apply directly to the court. They must first complete the administrative process and only then, if needed, challenge the decision in court. So what are the costs of RMPD proceedings? The administrative part is free of charge. There are no court or government fees involved. The only cost is a 17 PLN stamp duty for power of attorney if a legal representative is appointed. Legal representation fees are separate and depend on the law firm. If the authority rejects the carrier's position, the carrier can file a complaint with the administrative court. This requires a court fee, usually 400 PLN for most RMPD cases. If the carrier loses in the first court instance and appeals, they'll pay 100 PLN for a written justification and typically 200 PLN to file a cassation complaint. If the carrier wins, all fees are reimbursed, but if they lose, those costs remain with them, and they may also be ordered to pay the authorities legal fees. Foreign carriers who are most often affected by RMPD inspections must also appoint a legal representative for service of documents in Poland. This does not apply if the company uses registered electronic delivery. A representative is not needed immediately after receiving the inspection report, but is required once the notice of proceedings is issued. At that point, all correspondence will either go to the appointed representative or be added to the case files with the legal effect of delivery. If no representative is appointed, the carrier may never know that a penalty decision was issued, and the penalty may be automatically deducted from the deposit. If no deposit was collected, the penalty may be sent for enforcement. In summary, recovering a deposit can be complex, and in many cases, impossible. Penalties for RMPD violations are imposed regardless of the carrier's intent or fault. There's no possibility for the authority or court to reduce the fine and no explicit legal basis for waiving the penalty, as is possible with cent violations. Carriers considering deposit recovery should prepare for a lengthy procedure, often lasting several months. Quick refunds are only possible in exceptional cases. For example, when the deposit was collected despite the transport not being subject to RMPD notification at all. We hope this information helps you make an informed decision about whether pursuing a refund is worthwhile. For more details, we invite you to visit our website, pronicytransportu.pl.